I'm joined today by Josh Bernstein. He is a spokesman for AMAC, also a radio talk show host, strategist, writer. The topic today is the Cuban embargo. We, of course, talked to you recently about how President Obama indicated that we would be resuming a normalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba, looking to open an embassy there at some point. Josh, if I have read what you've written correctly, you're against this. Tell us why.
Well, I think that it sets a dangerous precedent that we are now negotiating openly and freely with dictatorships and dictatorship countries, Cuba being one of them. This embargo has been there for a long time. They treat their people, their human rights abuses. They're number 9 on the world's list for human rights abuses. So I just don't see that they have earned the right to have this embargo lifted. And then I also look at the fact that I believe because President Obama does not like to be repudiated in his policies, he wanted to close Guantanamo Bay way back when in 2009, he was not able to do that. So by normalizing these relations, this will then take some of that pressure off of him. And I believe that this is ultimately the goal, is to close Guantanamo Bay, which I believe would also be a geopolitical mistake, being that the relationship between Russia and Cuba is so strong.
All right. Well, I don't think that in the time President Obama has left as president, no matter what happens, Guantanamo Bay is going to be closed. So, but we could disagree on that. But let's at least put that aside for the immediate time. So it sounds like the standard you're using to determine whether the U.S. should have or not have embargoes, or whether we should have or not have diplomatic relations, is whether we're dealing with a regime that, as you said, is harsh against its own people. You don't like the regime element of Cuba, and based on that, you don't agree with the lifting of the embargo.
I don't agree with the lifting of the embargo because I don't really see how it would benefit America. And if we were so steadfast on lifting this embargo, then we would have said, okay, fine. How about 24 months with verifiable proof that you have made the revisions in your country to allow people to be free, to allow people to vote, to allow people to own, different properties and things like that, and not line people up for their political disagreements and execute them like has been done in the past.
Now, have you been advocating for the cease of American support and diplomatic relations with the current regimes in Uganda, Rwanda, Bahrain, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia? We have huge diplomatic relations with China, a huge human rights abuser. Would you end relations with all of those as well, based on the same rubric you've established with Cuba?
Well, I think that let's take China, for instance. China is a very different animal. You have over 1 billion people. You have a huge economy. Unfortunately, now has taken over the United States economy as the world's largest economy. And personally, my personal agreement, my belief system, no, I don't think we should negotiate with any third world regime, terrorist nation, if you will, that is a sponsor of terrorism, in my opinion.
Okay, and do you understand the economic impact that it would have, given the economic connection between China and the U.S., if we were to cease that relationship completely in the same fashion that you support maintaining with Cuba, in the sense that if you consider the amount of American bonds that are held by China, China has financed much of what we have happening in the United States. We get so many of our products from China. The profits of so many American companies that I presume you support are derived from the fact that we're using inexpensive labor in China. You would forego all of that stuff and you would accept all of the impacts it would have on the economy?
Well, I think that if you're taking all of that into consideration, I think that we need a new China policy. I believe that we ought to put more tariffs on their goods coming in and out of their country.
But you only have tariffs with a country with which you do have relations, right? Which is something that you just said you would totally end with China.
Well, I'm not saying that we would end it because, again, it's too intertwined. This isn't 11 million people and an embargo for 50 years. This is China that has been working with the United States for years. Not that I agree with the fact that we should be working with communist countries, but it's kind of like the sale. What does it have to do with the sale of tea in China?
Well, but Josh, I think the problem I'm having is you first established what you said was your standard for deciding whether or not we should do business with a country, When I brought up China, you first said you would also agree with completely cutting off all ties, but then
No,
you
I didn't
said,
say that.
okay, maybe I
Resetting
misunderstood.
the relations to make it more fair.
Okay,
We all know
but
that China
but what you
cheats.
most recently said was you wouldn't cut off all relations with China because there's way more people there and it would be more logistically complex. So are you saying that your standard, your moral standard for who the US should do business with is in part informed by convenience?
No, not necessarily. Like I said before, I think that with China, being that they have a huge economy and it has been intertwined with us, it would be almost impossible to cut off that relationship without detrimental circumstances occurring from that. However, I believe, just like Mitt Romney said back in 2012, which he was ridiculed and laughed at,
Yeah.
that we ought to change our policy and we ought to have more tariffs on their goods because they do get away with exploiting the labor and having everything come in here. I mean, if you do the Walmart game and you look at 10 items in your house, I guarantee you at least 9 out of those 10 are not going to be made in America. They're going to say
yeah,
that
but
they're made in
that's
China.
we're starting to splinter a little bit from kind of the main theme. So Cuba, you want the embargo. China, huge human rights abuser. There, no embargo. We're just very tied in with them, but you would increase tariffs. What about Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia, one of the most extreme fundamentalist Islamist regimes. They're beheading people. We have George W. Bush who goes over and is holding hands and kissing them. Would you also, if you're going to maintain an embargo with Cuba, it would seem completely dishonest intellectually to maintain any relations whatsoever with Saudi Arabia, right?
Well, the thing is with Saudi Arabia is we already had Barack Obama go over there and kneel down in front of them and kiss their ring. But getting that to the side, with Saudi Arabia, hopefully what's going to happen is that North Dakota and Colorado and Louisiana and some of these other places that are now starting to say to the Environmental Protection Agency, we don't care what you say. We're going to start drilling and showing you that we're going to produce our own oil. And I believe that hopefully we will take some of that relationship away at some point, and we won't be relying on foreign oil as much as we start drilling here in America and producing our own resources here at home. So to answer your question, I don't believe we should have very close relations with almost any regime. And to think that we want to lift an embargo against a communist nation, meanwhile, we want to take our closest ally, Israel, and we want to put sanctions on them and force them to somehow come up with some kind of state with the Hamas and Hezbollah factions near Israel is just ludicrous.
Yeah, but listen, I agree with you. There's no negotiating with Hamas. But again, I think that's a bit of a distraction. Here's where I see it, Josh. What I hear from you is you're saying embargo with Cuba. China and Saudi Arabia are bad. In my opinion, we could do hours of programming as to why they're way worse than Cuba. But with China, you're willing to increase tariffs in a way that won't really hurt our economy and so on and so forth. With Saudi Arabia, yeah, they're bad, but if and when we can get off of the foreign oil that they provide, then maybe you would do something about it. And when you look at Cuba, Cuba is a country that you're using communist kind of as an ad hominem, but the reality is Cuba poses no threat to us. This embargo is leftover political posturing from the Cold War. We're doing nothing good for the Cuban people or American businesses who would want to do business there by keeping this embargo going. And if the idea, hold on a second, Josh, hold on. And if the idea is that by maintaining the embargo, we're going to change their system of government, we know from experience from the last decades that that's not going to happen. So I don't see what are we gaining by maintaining this embargo?
Well, what are we gaining by opening it up? I don't believe that we're gaining anything at all. Because, I mean, Mariela Castro, Raul's daughter herself, said the Americans are fools if they absolutely think that somehow they're going to hit the no communist button and then all of a sudden turn to democracy. We know that's not going to happen. You just mentioned that communist regimes stay typically communist regimes. Marco Rubio, let's not forget, a Cuban immigrant, his parents came here from Cuba. They know how bad the Castro regime is. He said, thank God he's now going to be the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He said that they're not going to lift the embargo, which is good. The Senate would need to confirm anyone that would be to be in place for the embassy that he wants to create.
Right, but Josh, you and I are
the
conversation I'm trying to have with you is about the sense of this, not whether Marco Rubio would allow it in committee or not. I mean, we have a situation here where we are restricting Americans' ability to travel to Cuba. We are spending a lot of money enforcing that. We spend money enforcing the embargo. This is so far from fiscally conservative. You could open that up as a market for American businesses and bring in additional revenues. And in addition, you could open up that as as an area where we don't need to spend money enforcing an embargo. It would be hugely fiscally conservative. And again, the double standard with the other 10 regimes we currently have business with shows us that the regime argument alone is morally bankrupt.
Well, again, like I said, I don't see, again, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you. I don't see any benefit of opening up this embargo, none whatsoever.
But that may be your opinion, Josh, but we have analyses that tell us that there is a benefit.
We're legitimizing a communist regime, David, in my opinion.
And what are we doing in Saudi Arabia? Why have you not been writing articles about cutting off Saudi Arabia as opposed to, well, maybe if we can depend a little less on their oil, I would suggest some sanctions. It's a huge double standard, Josh.
Sanctions don't work. Sanctions give money to communist regimes. Sanctions give money to prop up dictatorships. We already know that. They don't work. I mean, even with Iran, the only thing that's going to change with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, any of these places is getting away from foreign interest as far as oil and basically depending on them. So I would love to see a reset in American policy in which we drill, baby, drill here at home, rather than, getting 70% of our oil and imports from other countries. So to answer your question, communism is communism no matter where it is. I would love to see it end everywhere, but we know that that's just not the reality. I mean, what's going to happen next? Are we going to normalize relations with North Korea? Are we going to normalize relations now and drop sanctions against Iran? So again, I understand what your argument is and the fact that we have done business for a long time with some of these other countries. I get that. But again, for me, I would rather see us not.
No, I can tell. What you're saying is that no matter what other countries we're doing business with, no matter what the experts say would be the economic benefit of lifting the embargo, you just don't want it to happen. And I think that that's coming through very clearly.
I don't see the benefit.
No, I would read all of the reports about what the benefit is.
I see the fact that Russia, I see this as a catalyst to being able to close Guantanamo Bay, which I believe is a strategic military location for us. 93 miles away is Cuba, and they would then fill that vacuum if we were to leave. And I believe that they already have a cozy relationship for 50 plus years, communists to communists. Whether you want to call Russia communist now or not doesn't really matter, because we know Vladimir Putin said in 2005 the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century was the fall of communism.
Yeah, but Josh, I think you're thinking about this the wrong way. We're out of time, but there's an article that actually points out that opening up this relationship with Cuba might actually be a way to put a wedge between Cuba and Russia. I think that you're just not, I think you're way off on this, but I do respect the fact that you came on and talked to me about it. We've been speaking with Josh Bernstein, spokesman for AMAC, radio host, etc., etc. Josh, thank you.
Thank you.